If we're going to talk about sustainability, perhaps it is worthwhile to talk about one of the great failures of sustainability. Although there have been many, where we can see the abuse that companies have left behind, this is one of those stories. There is a community just outside Buffalo called Love Canal. Now, Love Canal started out as a manufacturing facility for a chemical company, Fuller Chemicals, I believe. And what they used to do is in the production of the chemicals that they made, there of course was, garbage, a garbage part of it, an effluence they called it. So this effluence, which was not necessary for their production, was gathered together in barrels, and at the back of the factory, they had excavated a humongous dump. And over 40 or 50 years, they had piled all of these metal containers into the dump, holding the effluence of the factory production. When they finished filling the dump, they realized it's time to move on and find another site. Now we're going back to the 1930s all the way to the 1950s, I believe, or the 60s, when they moved out and found another site. When they moved out, they took the entire facility, all the property, and they gave it to the local school board for the princely sum of $1, with a codicil, a condition, that the school board never hold them responsible for any damage or pollution on the site. Now this is really even before the concept of pollution was known. We're talking the 50s, 60s. The school board took the site, but they really didn't do much with it. Fuller Chemical had backfilled the dump, and at this point the grass or weeds were growing there, and it was just one big giant empty lot. About 10 years later, the school board, doing what school boards do, which is managing schools, realized that it would be a great idea to build a community into which they could have a school. And that would create jobs for teachers, and that's a good thing for a school board. And so they made the decision to take this property that they had on their books and turn it into a community of approximately 250 low-income homes. And of course, there was a school right in the middle. They built the homes, people moved in, and life was going along. Now, there were some unusual things that were happening in the community, but nobody really knew about it. And these unusual things that came out much later was the fact that the cancer rate in this community was 4 times the average of New York State. The rate of deformed births was far greater than anywhere else in New York State. So there were a couple of medical issues that were going on, but nobody was able to connect the dots. Until one day, a student, a little kid from probably nursery school or kindergarten, came in with burns on her fingers. The teacher, who was on duty, said, "What happened to you?" And she was crying, she got burned, and so the teacher immediately thought that some of the older kids had brought some matches to school and that they had, harmed this child. So she asked the child to take her to the place where she got hurt. And the child, in tears, took her outside and into the schoolyard, and there was this puddle on the playground that looked like a puddle of water. Except the teacher noticed something very unusual about this puddle of water, and that is that it was bubbling. The water doesn't usually bubble, it just sort of sits there. So she realized something was wrong and, stood back. I guess she must have found some sort of a container to put this water in. And when the water was analyzed, it turned out to be acid, and that the child had actually had an acid burn. One thing leading to another, they discovered that the acid was coming from the containers that had been buried beneath this playground, because of course the playground was right on the dump site from the company, and the drums that they had buried 30, 40 years ago had of course started to rust, and the chemicals that were inside began to leach out. They leached into the water table, and they leached up and into the schoolyard. Of course, leaching into the water table is what created the pollution and the poisoning of the residents, the cancers, and the birth defects. And the acid was the revelation of this tragedy. So once this was discovered, the school board had a giant problem, since it was their land. Suddenly, overnight, all the residents of Love Canal realized they couldn't live there anymore. They couldn't drink the water anymore. They couldn't take a bath anymore. So they began abandoning the homes that they had purchased and getting out. Now, some people could leave, other people didn't have the resources to leave. But they also couldn't stay, so water had to be brought in, and all kinds of adjustments had to be made until the people could leave, and eventually the entire community was abandoned. 242 houses that people had worked and slaved to pay for were lost. Now, the ethical question is, who's responsible here? Is it the Fuller Chemical Company? Is it the school board? Is it the builders? I mean, the builders must have excavated to put in the water lines and the electrical cables. They surely would have seen all of this stuff. It was not 1,000 feet down. It was 3 feet down, maybe. Who bears the responsibility here? The cleanup, which meant the excavation and the purification of the earth even, because it was unbelievably contaminated, cost almost $500 million. I think it was 450 million. Someone has got to pay that bill. And so in this case, the bill went to Fuller Chemical. They didn't even know the tragedy that awaited the people who lived, who would move in on this neighborhood. They were not aware of the chemical disaster that they had planted slowly in their back dump. Why should they be responsible? The school council knew they were given land with a requirement that they don't hold Fuller Chemical responsible. Surely, when the school was developing the property, all of this was known. They had to have excavated the barrels. Why isn't the builder held responsible? They knew what was being done. So you can see how the problem can become complicated. The bottom line is Fuller Chemical had to pay for the cleanup. That money came off their bottom line. If you were a shareholder, you would have lost the ability to distribute $500 million. Not only that, but I'm reasonably certain that when Fuller moved to its next location, it was doing exactly the same thing. So there was another $500 million bombshell waiting for them that had to be cleaned up. Sustainability would have looked at that and never gotten to the point of digging a hole in the dump. They would have looked at the effluents and found, either through chemistry or through other technologies, a way to deal with it so that it did not become a burden on the company and make the company sustainable. Because it's entirely possible that if Fuller Chemical was any smaller, it might not have been able to sustain the cost of the cleanup, and that $500 million or maybe $1 billion might have wiped them out. They would be bankrupt. There would be no repair, and the shareholders who invested, thinking that they were dealing with a wholesome company, suddenly discover that their company is worth nothing and it's bankrupt. So it could have taken a very different turn. As it was, they lost a tremendous amount in terms of profitability, but it was recoverable. In the business world, there is a very interesting axiom that's often talked about. It says that you can only have 2 out of 3 of these things at any one time in business. Those things are, you can have a low price, you can have high quality, and you can have fast delivery, but you can't have them together. So if you want to have a low price and fast delivery, you can't have high quality. If you want to have a low price and fast and high quality, you can't have fast delivery. You can't combine those 3 together and make them work. It's impossible. And this concept kind of touches on sustainability. If you want to be sustainable, you can't be viewing your environment, your materials, as disposable, even though you are disposing them when you sell them to other people. You have got to view your land or the assets you use off the land, or the animals, or whatever it is, as something that is sustainable and therefore needs to be processed in a way that doesn't allow them to disappear. So you can only get 2 out of 3. Now, there's no doubt that managing the environment is probably very difficult, because it's going to require more money to be sustainable than it might require to be non-sustainable. To simply be able to rape the land, cut the trees, and never plant anything is obviously less costly. Less costly means my prices can be more effective. So now we have to think of how we can be sustainable and still be competitive in our pricing. And that was a big issue that was spoken about in America when they were talking about the NAFTA treaty and the fact that companies could go down to Mexico who had no EPA standards, and they could pollute the heck out of the sky and not pay for environmental safeguards, and it would make them competitive. Or more than competitive, it would make them price leaders. So companies moved down there in droves. 70,000, I think they said, American companies moved into Mexico because the rules and regulations were easier. So is that how we define free trade? It doesn't seem very free. One country demands certain environmental guidelines, which cost $1 a product, let's just say, and the other country doesn't need it, and so they're minus the $1. That doesn't seem like free trade. It seems like biased trade. And that was an issue that, of course, was dealt with. So what we're trying to do is come up with a term that's called best practices. What are the best sustainable ways of managing our resources so that we can sustain them and yet be a viable and competitive business? So usually we may have to endure some short-term pain, but it will be for long-term gain. So all of these challenges for us to be stewards and warriors and look after our partners and take care of the planet seems so overwhelming. And some people might think, we're doing a terrible job of this. And they'll use the stories of the Exxon Valdez, it was an oil spill, the BP oil spill, the Love Canal story as examples of our failures. But the reality is that we actually are making progress if you look at the numbers, if you look at the reports. The numbers tell us that we're progressing, even though the headlines don't tell us that. And the reason the headlines don't tell us that is because the headlines are about politics. And politics usually thrive wherever there are issues. And therefore, sometimes in order to create issues, the truth needs to be manipulated. So the fact that world hunger is diminishing is not often talked about. But the fact that you may have one part of the world that no longer has a particular food because it's been destroyed through overproduction, that gets talked about. Because that feeds into the political narrative of that political party. And we see that in pollution control and environmental improvement, America's way ahead of itself. I'm just reading some stats. Air pollution is down from 0.3 particles per 1,000 tons to 0.08. That's like a 66% reduction. I mean, is that perfect? No, but it's amazing as a reduction. And don't forget that was done while still maintaining the ability of these companies to be competitive in the marketplace. Similarly to Mexico, if America has pollution controls that cost money and up the price of a product, it's going to be very hard to compete internationally and even locally if another country has no pollution controls and therefore charges less. It's not complicated economics to understand that. Another interesting statistic is that world poverty is actually diminishing. This is from the United Nations World Health data, that since 1990, 1.2 billion people in the planet have risen above what they called extreme poverty. That means that approximately, according to the United Nations, just under 10% of the world is still in that state of extreme poverty. That means 90% of the world is doing way better. Now, they're not living in America, they're not living in Canada, but they're certainly moving up and not down. You look at the issue of climate change. Again, there's a humongous diversity of opinion. How can both scientists be right? I can't understand that. But I'm not going to debate climate change. However you want to understand it, the diversity of opinion means that we have to be able to consider both aspects of the argument and try to find a compromise. Because clearly, from a scientific level, we are not in agreement. And so taking one side or the other is going to be a dangerous move. We are making progress, but we need to allow science to do its thing and not become part of some agenda. There are things like 3D printing of biological mass, as I said to you, beef, Um, there's hydroponic foods. There are rooftop gardens. There's all kinds of sustainability ideas that are out there that are enormously exciting. And therefore, we should embrace them and try to use them to grow our economies. And that will make us sustainable. Thank you.